Madelyn, or Maddie Rae Clifton, was born on the 17th of June, 1990, to parents Steve and Sheila Clifton. She lived with her parents and older sister, Jessie, in Jacksonville, Florida, and was described by friends and family as passionate, energetic, and full of life. At just 8 years old, Maddie was a popular and promising student at the San Jose Catholic School, a private school in Jacksonville, where both she and her sister attended. On Tuesday, November 3rd, 1998, the day proceeded like usual. Whilst the adults around her were focused on the fact it was Election Day. Closely following the news, Maddie came home from school just after 4:30 p.m. and practiced on her piano for a short while until Sheila arrived home. As soon as Sheila walked through the door, Maddie begged her to let her play outside with the neighborhood kids before dinner. Sheila agreed as long as she wasn't long, and with that, Maddie ran outside to join her friends. This would be the last time her mother would ever see her alive. Just over an hour after Maddie left to go and play, Sheila called Maddie and her sister home for dinner, as promised. But Maddie did not return. The neighborhood kids had long since retreated home themselves, but there was no sign of the 8-year-old anywhere. Sheila began knocking on doors up and down the street, asking any and everyone if Maddie was with them, or if anyone had seen her recently, but to no avail. Help was quickly offered by the locals, and a search was beginning when Sheila dialed 911. To report her daughter missing at 6:33 p.m. A massive search ensued with over 1,000 from the local area joining in the search to find Maddie. Search parties of both the public and law enforcement were non-stop. Police sealed the area off and interviewed neighbors. Yellow ribbons sprung up everywhere as people joined together to pray that the 8-year-old would be found safe. The media quickly picked up on the story and were continuously asking the wider public for leads on the missing 8-year-old. The U.S. Army Reserve and National Guard were even called in to assist and went through manholes, culverts, and even the local sewer system in the hope of finding anything that would bring Maddie home. 3 days after Maddie disappeared, her parents held one of many press conferences, begging for their daughter's safe return. A $50,000 reward was posted for information leading to the child being found, and Sheila spoke to the public and then directly to Maddie, saying, "Maddie is a very strong little girl. She is full of love. Maddie, if you are out there and you can hear us, we are ready for you to come back home." But no new leads were uncovered. In the days after she disappeared, everyone was hopeful that she would turn up alive. But as time went by and with no new leads, that hope was dissipating fast. When the police looked like they were winding down the searches for the youngster, the FBI became involved. The reward was doubled to $100,000, and America's Most Wanted offered to broadcast the story. The community was doing everything in its power to keep Maddie Clifton at the forefront of everyone's mind. Police named their first suspect just days after Maddie went missing, a neighbor, Larry Grisham. Larry was questioned more than 20 times by investigators and had his home searched 9 times in connection with the case. After it was reported by another witness that Maddie was with Larry on the day she disappeared, hitting golf balls in another neighbor's garden. After apparently running out of balls, she was spotted by witnesses walking in the direction towards her home, presumably to collect more, but never made it home. Larry corroborated the witness's testimony and told detectives he had been playing with Maddie that day. He told them that Maddie did indeed go home to collect some more golf balls, but did not return. When asked why he wasn't alarmed at this, he simply said he assumed Sheila had told Maddie dinner was ready and she had to stay home. Larry Grisham had a checkered past. He had been arrested twice before, almost 20 years earlier in connection with 2 different sexual battery cases, but in both incidents, charges were dropped. Larry had also picked up charges in relation to driving under the influence and car theft. Despite his past, Larry was a well-known figure in the community. Whilst he was 45 years old at the time of Maddie's disappearance, he was often seen playing with the neighborhood children. Larry submitted to a polygraph test in order to prove his innocence, which he failed. Despite this, he was able to provide a strong alibi and gave DNA samples to the police. He was free to go. While Larry had been freed, it meant the search for Maddie and whoever had taken her continued. She continued to be featured on local and national news, both on the TV and the papers. Her face was plastered over missing posters and posted in stores up and down the state. The community waited with bated breath for any update on the youngster. The authorities feared that Jessie Clifton was also at risk and stationed officers at the family home. If there was any chance this unknown kidnapper was going to return for Jessie, then he would face a nasty surprise. Jessie would later describe this experience. As an 11-year-old, you'd be thinking about toys and games, but instead, she was living her worst nightmare. 7 days after Maddie went missing, her parents were spending the morning filming a segment on their daughter for a national news program. Jessie was close by playing Monopoly with one of the law enforcement officers stationed to keep her safe. Sheila closed off the interview by reading an excerpt from the book. "I promise I'll find you. If I had no other way, I'd walk, I'd crawl, I'd run, and search to the very ends of the earth for you, my precious one." As the crew were packing away just minutes later, screams were heard in the home across the road from the Cliftons. The home across the street belonged to the Phillips family. The family had moved to the neighborhood some 18 months before Maddie disappeared. Melissa and Steve Phillips lived with their only son, Joshua. Joshua was 14 years old when Maddie disappeared and was described as a nice but quiet boy. The family kept to themselves for the most part, but were friendly with the rest of their neighbors. Steve Phillips moved his family around often. He was later described as abusive, unable to hold down a job. It seems a lot was happening behind closed doors that nobody knew of. Not only, they were blasted wide open. Joshua Phillips knew Maddie and had joined in on the searches for her. He had spoken with detectives when she went missing, telling them that he had seen her, but hadn't spoke to her on the day she disappeared. His story conflicted with another witness, who claimed that they had seen Maddie playing and noticed Joshua Phillips creeping up on her. The witness had brushed off what she had seen as the two youngsters playing and stopped watching. Little did the witness know was that Joshua Phillips had been banned from playing with Maddie and her sister, after an incident a few weeks before Maddie disappeared, where Joshua was found alone and uninvited in Jessie Clifton's bedroom, with no explanation as to why he found himself there. Following the source of the screams, the Cliftons' investigators and other neighbors watched as Melissa Phillips ran into the street, screaming that she had found the body of Maddie Clifton under her son's waterbed. Officers quickly followed Melissa back to her home, where she described how she had been cleaning her son's room when she noticed a leak and a large amount of unknown foul-smelling fluid on his floor. Whilst looking for the source, she came across an unimaginable sight. She lifted Joshua's mattress up and saw Maddie Clifton's dead body trapped between the frame. Police were immediately dispatched to Joshua's school to arrest him, while others worked to remove the child and establish what had happened to her. Maddie Clifton was found in a fetal position, partially clothed, naked from the waist down apart from her socks, which she still had on. Sheriff Nat Glover would describe finding her. Her body was securely entombed in the encasement of that waterbed. Maddie had multiple wounds from where she had been stabbed and bludgeoned by Joshua. Joshua was arrested whilst in class on suspicion of murder and taken for questioning. There he confessed to the murder and told the investigators his version of events. The 14-year-old told detectives that on the day Maddie disappeared, the two had been playing baseball together in his yard. Joshua described how he was not allowed friends over, often due to his father's bad temper. But Maddie approached him asking him to play, and while his parents were both out voting, he said yes. During the game, Joshua told the police that he had accidentally hit Maddie in the face with a baseball. Maddie was hurt and screaming, Joshua said. He did and said all he could to make the 8-year-old quiet, fearing repercussions from his father. He told police how he got Maddie inside his home and remembered her clothes falling off as she struggled being led into his bathroom. And that's where the attack began. Joshua hit Maddie hard with the baseball bat to stop her from screaming and knocking her out in the process. His parents came home mere minutes after the attack. Quickly, Joshua stuffed Maddie, who unbeknownst to him was alive but unconscious underneath his mattress. He then went downstairs, trying to cover up what happened and appeared normal for his parents, chatting with them and eating dinner. His parents didn't notice the 8-year-old's whimpers throughout the evening, but Joshua did. When he returned to his room later that night, he discovered that Maddie was very much still alive, fatally wounded, but alive. Knowing he couldn't let her go for fear of being told on, he stabbed Maddie 9 times in the neck and chest, over and over again, until this time, he was certain she was dead. The medical examiner noted that Maddie suffered 3 separate attacks, any of which could have been fatal. The examiner said it was unlikely that Maddie would have survived the bludgeoning, and what Joshua had taken for whimpering was more likely to have been the death rattle. There were 9 stab wounds to Maddie's chest and abdomen. The penknife pierced her neck and sliced through her windpipe. The autopsy found that although she had been found partially clothed, there were no indications of sexual assault. The autopsy concluded that Maddie's final cause of death, drowning in her own blood. After Maddie's body was recovered, the police searched the rest of his room and discovered some gruesome mementos. Joshua had kept a missing person flyer from the searches for Maddie alongside a picture of Jessie Clifton, a picture that had gone missing from the family home sometime before the murder. Rick Seibler, chief detectives, commented on this saying, "There was some infatuation on his part with Jessica. The weapons used in the attack were quickly found by police and used to corroborate his story, and Joshua was charged with first-degree murder. Shortly thereafter, on November 17, 1998, State Attorney Harry Shorstein announced plans to try Joshua Phillips for the murder of Maddie Clifton as an adult, which meant that if convicted of the murder, he would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shorstein attributed this decision to the fact that if he was to be tried as a juvenile, then he would be released within just 5 years, ready to kill again. Even though Maddie's body was found just inches from where he slept, despite the fact the murder weapons were found in his bedroom, and although he detailed the events of the murder to the police, Joshua Phillips pled not guilty to the murder of Maddie Clifton. Due to public outrage and the huge interest in the case within Jacksonville, Joshua's lawyers were able to successfully motion for the trial to be moved and was scheduled to be held in Polk County, Florida, to ensure that Joshua Phillips received a fair trial. On the 6th of July, 1999, Joshua Phillips' trial at the Polk County Courthouse began. During the opening statements, the prosecution told the court they were about to detail how Joshua was guilty of the most brutal first-degree murder of an 8-year-old child. The prosecution's case mainly focused on the events that Joshua had himself confessed to the police during his initial arrest interview. They told the court how Joshua had dragged the 8-year-old into his room, bludgeoning her, and then stabbing her with a penknife to get her to be quiet. The prosecution went into detail about how he had stored Maddie's lifeless body in the frame of his bed, sealing the edges with tape and desperately trying to cover up the foul smell that began emitting from his bedroom. During the initial searches, police visiting the Phillips home before Maddie's body was recovered had noticed the smell, with Melissa putting it down to the animals in the house being the cause. The jury heard that in the hours after Maddie went missing, Joshua grabbed a torch and slotted himself into the crowds of people searching for her. He helped hand out flyers, spoke with Jessie about her sister's disappearance, all while knowing he had the missing girl under his bed. He was sleeping right on top of her. The jurors heard how Joshua had acted normally throughout the whole 7 days of searches, that nobody suspected a thing. The prosecution told the court that police had spoken with Joshua in the days after Maddie had gone missing. Joshua had told detectives that he knew the young girl but wasn't allowed to play with her due to the 6-year age gap between them. The state's medical expert testified during the trial and told the court how Maddie had suffered 3 separate attacks, and the jurors heard how each of the wounds would have been fatal around 30 minutes after infliction. Maddie was already dying before she was stabbed. The court heard how Maddie's neck had been stabbed so viciously that wounds perforated her windpipe, causing her to bleed to death or drown in her blood. The medical examiner went on to describe how 2 of the stab wounds were inflicted post-mortem. Finally, they told the jurors how Maddie was found with her little hands clutching at the bed frame. Jurors cried as they heard from Maddie's parents that she would have fought till her last breath. The trial lasted just 2 days. The defense called no witnesses, knowing the prosecution had a strong open and shut case. The defense instead focused on trying to convince the jury that the 14-year-old murderer was no monster. The defense attorney, Richard Nichols, said the state wants to tell you that Joshua Phillips was a monster, but the evidence shows he is not a monster. Regardless of your verdict, Mr. Phillips has essentially forfeited his life. Richard Nichols for the defense asked the jury to consider finding Joshua Phillips guilty of a lesser charge based on their argument that the killing was not premeditated and that Joshua had no plans to kill Maddie that day. They asked the jury to consider how panicked the 14-year-old was at the thought of being abused by his father when he came home and found an 8-year-old crying on his lawn. It had to be a product of panic. What we certainly have is manslaughter under the law. Prosecutor Harry Shorstein reminded the jury after this that there was no blood on the baseball or anywhere on the lawn, once again putting the final nail in Joshua Phillips' coffin, that this attack was planned and had been planned ever since he had been caught breaking into Maddie's sister's bedroom. And with that, the prosecution rested their case. The jury was out. Just 2 hours of deliberation later, they came back with a verdict. Joshua Phillips was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Maddie Rae Clifton. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Evidence that couldn't be used in court was later revealed shortly after the sentencing by the prosecution. Harry Shorstein was finally able to tell the public how in the minutes before Joshua met Maddie on that fatal day, he had been watching extremely violent pornography at home. Shorstein, whilst unable to have used this in court, argued that this was yet another reason why Joshua sought out the 8-year-old that day. Despite getting some form of justice for their daughter, the Clifton family was never able to be the same again. Steve and Sheila divorced shortly after the case was over, Having been high school sweethearts, the couple could not go on in their grief and remain together. Jessie, now 35 years old, still talks of her sister to this day, in recent interviews saying, "I will fight for her until I'm no longer on this earth, and I always will. She was my best friend, and I will always fight for her, because I know if it was the other way around, she'd do it for me." In 2000, Steve Phillips died after a crash in Tallahassee. He was not wearing a seatbelt at the time of the accident and was thrown from the vehicle, dying at the scene. Melissa Phillips has moved on and since remarried, but has chosen to keep her identity secret, moving multiple times for anonymity over the years while she continued to campaign for a reduction in her murderous son's sentence. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that juveniles who were tried as adults for their crimes do not qualify for the mandatory life sentencing an adult would. And so Joshua Phillips' team pressed for him to be resentenced to reflect this, and the request was granted. In 2017, Joshua appeared before Circuit Judge Waddell Wallace III to be resentenced. Joshua prepared a statement, which he read out to the Clifton family saying, "I don't pretend to know or understand your pain or to grasp the void I created in your lives. I can say this, I do understand pain. I have become quite intimate with suffering. Growing up in prison, I've seen many dark things, and I've been to some dark places. Many times throughout this journey, I came close to ending my life just to escape it all." Judge Wallace said that there was allowance, even in the new laws, for juveniles to be convicted to life without parole if the circumstances were exceptional. And in this case, the judge believed they were saying, "I believe this is one of the rarest and unusual crimes that warrants life in prison." Joshua's team applied for resentencing again 2 years later, where a psychologist testified that Phillips was genuinely remorseful for his crimes, and he had rehabilitated and was working in the prison, helping other inmates research ways they could reduce their sentences. To the relief of the Cliftons, the judge upheld the conviction yet again, and stated that Joshua's sentence would come up for review in 2023, 25 years into his sentence, and noted, "The facts demonstrate the brutality of the murder of Maddie Clifton. Her death was not accidental, it was intended. Her death was not quick or painless, it was long and agonizing." These facts also highlight disturbing aspects of defendant's behavior. 1. The callousness and ruthlessness he demonstrated in the murder itself. 2. The cool, calm, and collected manner in which he carried on life, even helping in the search. And 3. The fact that he slept on top of her body for 6 days. All of these actions indicate to the court the existence of something far more than mere immaturity, impetuosity, or the inability to assess consequences. Joshua Phillips remains in prison to this day.